What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and today we're going to look at a deck that's been quietly doing work on mtgo. In case you didn't know, Wizards post the Magic the Gathering Online League results, all the decks that went 5-0 in a league. They do that twice a week, and usually this is a good place to go to find like off-the-wall or off-kilter decks people are developing or testing that are sort of apart from the standard norm, the tedium of standard. But usually you don't take these decks too seriously until they become part of a larger trend, and that is where today's deck comes in, because this deck has gone 5-0 in the last 3 league results postings, which is when you really start wanting to pay attention to the deck. And given how budget it is, I really wanted to bring it to light. So today we're going to talk mono blue wizards. Now, one thing before we jump in here, I did this deck rotation proof. You knew that already. You saw both the title and the thumbnail, and you're observant. You're not a stupid person, so you knew that. But obviously, the version of the deck that's doing so well in mtgo currently is not rotation proof. And there's a couple of pieces that'll rotate out in just a few weeks here, but not to worry. We don't really lose anything too integral to the deck structure. We can pretty much just keep rocking and rolling with what we're left over with in the format, much less what we'll end up with when Ravnica comes out. So the deck is left almost completely intact because it's more or less built around 2 pieces that won't go anywhere anytime soon. And I say built around because on the one hand, we're sort of a Wizards retort deck. This is the whole reason that the deck bothers to call itself a Wizards deck. It's because it's trying to just play Counterspell in Standard and get this down for 2 mana as often as possible. And having Counterspell in Standard is pretty much as good as it sounds, especially for a tempo deck. You know, we want to disrupt our opponent. That usually means playing spells on their turn, but we also have to play spells on our own time. You know, we want to play creatures on our own turn, and this allows us to do just that while still leaving our shields up, being ready to hard counter just about literally anything. But for a relatively low mana investment, you know, we can leave shields up for only 2 mana, and that's really, really important. So we're kind of a Wizards deck, if only because we want to make sure that Wizards Retort costs Counterspell 2 mana as often as possible. But on the other hand, we're also a Curious Obsession deck. Now, one of the ways that Retort can be such a good card in this deck is because it ends up being a cheap way of protecting whatever you have on your side of the board that's currently obsessed. You know, the old adage about the cat is correct. Curiosity kills. As soon as you slap this aura on one of your guys, it's effectively marked for death. Your opponent's going to start throwing lightning strikes and stuff at it. So Retort can just be a cheap way of protecting whatever's enchanted with this aura. Because as soon as you put this on a creature, you want to keep it going as many turns as you can, because this is an unbelievable card advantage engine that also gives the creature a power boost. So this will just end up doing, you know, a total of an extra 4 or 5 damage and drawing you an extra 4 or 5 cards over the course of some games, depending on how long you can protect that creature. So in some ways, we're also a Curious Obsession deck. So we're trying to get the most out of 2 cards here. We want to juice Wizard's Retort, turn it into a counterspell as often as we feasibly can, but we're also trying to milk Curious Obsession. So with that in mind, if we're a Wizard's Retort deck, we have to play Wizards, obviously. If we're a Curious Obsession deck, we just have to play a bunch of small creatures. So that translates into play a bunch of small wizards. But luckily, we've got a really good selection of them, actually, believe it or not. Starting with Siren Storm Tamer, which is the biggest no-brainer in the entire deck. You know, this works well with both of our featured cards. This virtually guarantees a turn 2 Wizard's Retort if we can get it down on turn 1. That's awesome. But it also goes really well with Curious Obsession. This virtually guarantees a card starting on turn 2. Turns out we want to enable both of those cards on turn 2 as often as possible, and Siren Storm Tamer is really the only way to do it in these colors. So we want to play all 4 of this. Plus it has the added benefit of being able to like jump in front of stuff. Like we have a bigger creature that we want to finish the game with, or maybe another creature that's wearing a Curious Obsession. Then we can always just sacrifice the Siren Storm Tamer and go like, no, jump in front of removal and stuff. So that's another added benefit. You just get so much work out of Siren Storm Tamer in this deck. But we also get to see the return of MC Herald down here at the 1-drop slot. All 4 copies of this, and the deck actually plays Slitherblade right now, but it's about to rotate. The entire reason that it plays Slitherblade is because Slitherblade doesn't die to Goblin Chainwhirler. MC Herald does. That kind of sucks. But, you know, if you can get a Curious Obsession on this starting on turn 2, then it won't die to Chainwhirler. So at least there's that. You got that going for you. And it's just if they can't do anything about it and you can counter the spells they try to kill it with, then you're going to end up just dealing a bunch of free, unblockable damage with this and drawing a bunch of cards. But even if you don't get a Curious Obsession on it, it can sometimes end up dealing like 2 to 4 or 5 damage for you over the course of the game just by itself too. So this is fine. It's a source of extra damage even if you don't enchant it. But when you do enchant it, it's a near guaranteed source of extra cards, and that makes it definitely worth playing in the 1-drop slot. But moving into the 2-drops here, we're also going to play 4 copies of Myrtle Trickster, definitely. This is a wizard, so we kind of have to play it, but we ain't mad about it either. This card is amazing, and anyone can tell it's pushed. Just because it hasn't found its niche in Standard yet, doesn't mean it's not a good card. This just does all the amazing things. And if I was going to list all the corner plays that Trickster makes available, we'd be here all night. It'd be like a 45-minute video. But needless to say, this card does an awful lot of things. You can play it a few different ways. You can play it when your opponent announces that they're going to move to their combat step. You tap down a couple of guys, keep them from attacking. Or you let their creatures go ahead and attack, flash in Trickster, and make them lose abilities. Things like Rekindling Phoenix and Scarab God, if you make them lose abilities and then initiate double blocks and kill them, then they'll lose their abilities, obviously, that allow them to come back later. Phoenix won't make that little guy, that 0/1 guy, Scarab God won't have the text that allows it to pop back to their hand. So that's a good way of taking care of creatures like that. And creatures that are indestructible, like Hazaret and Ronus, again, initiate double blocks and you can take care of those guys because they won't be indestructible. So there's just so many cool things you can do with Myrtle Trickster right now. Not to mention just playing it at the end of your opponent's turn, tapping down a guy or two and getting in a good combat step. There's just, again, it would take all night if I listed all the cool things that Trickster does. We're also going to work in 3 copies of Exclusion Mage, and I would like for there to be a 4th copy, but I also don't really want to change anything about the deck at all, so there you go. Here we are. But I'm not even sure that a 4th copy is warranted. Against Control, this almost never has a viable target, so it's just a 3-mana 2/2. Nobody likes Grey Ogres or Scathed Zombies, so it's usually a bad card in competitive Standard. But also, against Mono Red, you run the risk of, the only actual target being a Goblin Chain Whirler. You usually don't want to return that to their hand. So there are issues with this card, but 90% of the time, most times, there will be something on the other side of the table that you don't mind putting back in their hand. And besides, this is just it's a quintessential tempo card. You wreck their tempo, put something back in their hand, take away their turn 2 or 3, and you're getting a creature on your side of the battlefield. So in a way, it's an effective 2-for-1, if only for a turn or so. But that's exactly what Tempo wants to do, Jack. So card is just unbelievable. Plus, it's a wizard, and we want to run those anyway. So it's got a home here. But let's back up a little bit here and go back to the 2-drop slot for a second and explore that a little bit further. Because right now, I've seen the deck play Spellweaver Eternal. It seems like a good pick, but it does rotate soon, so we don't have that option. Now, I've also seen the deck play a 2-of Mystic Archaeologist, which is the right creature type, and seems really good against Control in the late game, making sure you just get fistfuls of cards. I've moved it to the sideboard. I'm not playing it in the main. Instead, I'm reserving 2 slots for a 2-of Naban, Dean of Iteration in the main deck. I don't think that we should play this up until rotation. I think Spellweaver Eternal is probably the best main deck choice for this, but after rotation, Naban looks pretty good. He does die to Goblin Chain Whirler. I get that argument. All that's true, but so does Spellweaver unless you can play an instant right then and there when they play their Goblin Chain Whirler. That's the only way you can protect it. Now, Naban is always going to die to a Goblin Chain Whirler, but I still think it's very much worth it, especially given that it supercharges, Exclusion Mage and Myrtle Trickster, for that matter. Those are both enter the battlefield triggers on wizards that we can double if we have a Naban out, and that is really, really good against the majority of aggro decks in the format. You'll either, tap down a couple of creatures so they can't attack during their attack step, or maybe you'll tap down a couple of creatures with 1 Myrtle Trickster so you can get a good combat step in. Same thing with Exclusion Mage, all you Naban into Exclusion Mage is pretty much going to decimate whatever they played onto their board up to that point. So being able to double up on those EDB triggers is ridiculous. So I went with the 2-of Naban, and it's been pretty sweet in testing so far. But we're not done with creatures here, actually. We got one more to talk about because we need a finisher. We need a way to lie all of our enemies at our mercy. That's a line from Shakespeare's The Tempest, so it's only appropriate that we play 4 Tempest Gen in this slot. See what I did there? We're cultured around here. And to paraphrase another line from the Tempest, look at all the good creatures here. It's true of this deck. And it's true of Tempest Gen as well, you know. Genie is ridiculous as far as finishers go. Because we have the same problems that a lot of tempo decks do. You know, we can end up doing 14, 16 damage. We have a hard time actually crossing the finish line. And Tempest Gen is awesome for that. Especially given that we have ways of, you know, tapping down our opponent's big flyers. Or just returning their big flyers to their hand. And getting in a big attack step or two with the Tempest Gen. Now, we're playing 17 total spells in the deck, but I've already shown you 8 of them, so we actually don't have too much longer to go. And I'll start with the rest of the counter spells that we're playing. So we're actually playing 8 total counter spells in this deck. We're playing 2 copies of Spell Pierce, 1 copy of Negate, and a copy of Dive Down. Even though Dive Down doesn't quote-unquote counter spells, it basically does. We'll be using it as a counter spell 10 times out of 10. But do note that this also saves a creature from Goblin Chainwhirler's Enter the Battlefield trigger, which can also be really important. But for all intents and purposes, this is a counter spell against spot removal. So we're going to play at least 1 copy of that, but we'll balance it with the Pierces and Negates. Now, both of these have the ability to counter things like Teferi, other Planeswalkers, artifacts, enchantments like, you know, History of Benalia and other sagas, and other important enchantments. It's not like those are the only ones we're playing. It also counters silliness like Nexus of Fate and Fogs or whatever. So both of these are really, really important. Spell Pierce all the way up until turn 4, 5, 6 in some cases, because a lot of the times what we're going to be using these 2 spells in particular for, Negate and Spell Pierce, is not only countering spot removal that they're trying to kill creatures that are, you know, enchanted by Curious Obsession with, but also things like Settle the Wreckage, Fumigate, Cleansing Nova, any of these sweeper type spells. Both Pierce and Negate are fantastic against. Usually they're racing us to a Settle the Wreckage or racing us to a Fumigate, and they want to play it as early on in the game as they possibly can. Well, Spell Pierce is going to stop those spells 10 times out of 10 in those situations, and it's just phenomenal for that. But Negate can counter those spells and more, things like Teferi again, all the way until turn 12. So I want to run at least the 1 copy of that. Now, we're also playing 3 copies of Blink of an Eye in the deck, which ostensibly replaces Unsummon. Now, hopefully they'll reprint Unsummon. It's somewhat likely that they will in the next set, because I'd really rather play it. The difference between 1 and 2 mana in a tempo deck is actually a lot bigger than you might think it is. Tempo decks, one of their big things is using their mana as efficiently as possible to, like, double spell on certain turns. You know, we get a spell on our turn and a spell on your turn, their turn. So that can be really important for tempo decks. And losing a 1 mana bounce spell actually hurts a little bit, but Blink of an Eye is a good replacement. If we're going to be taxed on our Unsummon, this gives us a lot for our tax dollars. You know, this allows us to return any non-land permanent, not just creatures, to our opponent's hand. It's still really good for the old, you know, 25-year-old trick of bounce that to your hand. Counterspell it when you try to play it again. It still does that well. If we want to supercharge it, pump a bunch of mana into it, we can kick it and draw a card. That's really important for a tempo deck. So this is still a tempo deck's dream, but I'd probably really rather play Unsummon, all things considered. But this is just as good as, like, getting a creature out of the way of Tempest Gen and getting in like a 6 or 7 point attack around their big flyer. So it's still good for that. Like in the late game, this far outclasses Unsummon. So I'm not too mad about having to play Blink. But we'll finish off the main here with 2 copies of Chart of Course, which is just phenomenal here. You know, this is almost always 2 mana for 2 cards for card advantage, which is a pretty raw deal. You know, this follows up a Siren Storm Tamer or a Mistcloaked Herald really well, and it's really good on turns where you proc a Curious Obsession. You know, in 1 turn you can draw 4 cards for effectively 2 mana. You get a card from your draw step, you know, a card from Curious Obsession procking, and you get 2 cards off of Chart of Course. You pay 2 mana, you've drawn 4 cards that turn, kid. That's a crazy deal. So, like, Chart of Course is just crazy on Curious Obsession turns, but it doesn't even have to have anything enchanted with Obsession. It's a fine card by itself. Again, we want to attack in this deck anyway. So very often, this is 2 cards for 2 mana. That's one of the best deals in Standard. Now, there's nothing to really get excited about in the mana base, just 22 islands. Not much to speak of. We want to play a relatively low land count here. We're not really doing anything above 3 mana in this iteration of the deck. And even the current iteration really only plays Commit to Memory in the 4-drop slot. That's a very good card, which we won't have access to anymore. That kind of sucks. But even the one that plays, you know, an ostensible 4-drop still only plays 22 islands. You really don't need too much more than that. The most expensive thing we're doing in this version of the deck is kicking a Blink of an Eye. So we don't really need all the lands in the world. We get to focus our slots on good creatures and spells spells and stuff. So there's that, but there's also the fact that we want to play only islands because we're running Tempest Djinn and we don't want Field of Ruin or Arch of Araska like messing with that. So just islands and nothing else. Here's the sideboard right here, and it's actually pretty cut and dry. You know, we've got Negate in there against Control and the odd combo deck, like Paradoxical Outcome or Godfair's Gift. It works against those pretty well, too. We've also got Mystic Archaeologist in there against Control. Again, just drawing a bunch of cards, you know, just every single turn. That seems to be, that's good against Control, so we'll do that. It's the right creature type, too. So, but we'll also play 3 copies of Deep Freeze. This is fantastic against green, mostly, but it's also good against, like, Rekindling Phoenix and creatures like that. So, Deep Freeze is probably, all things considered, the worst card in the deck, but it's still a fine card for taking out creatures that we don't really have any other options against. Things that get too big, like Galta, or creatures that we, you know, have abilities we can't deal with. We've also got River's Rebuke. This is mostly in there against aggro and green, you know, which I guess is a mid-range aggro deck, but still. Decks with a bunch of creatures, we'll play River's Rebuke, because if we get to 6 mana and we just sweep all their stuff back to the hand, we pretty much win the game on the spot most of the time. But we'll also play a full complement of Syncopate. Just about every version of the deck that I've seen, at least on League results so far, runs at least 3, if not 4 Syncopate in the sideboard. That's because sometimes you want to just become a control deck, especially against aggro decks. Now, this does allow you to have yet another tool against Settle the Wreckage, Fumigate, and all that stuff against the control decks. But against aggro decks, this is great. Syncopate is ridiculous in the first couple of turns of the game, especially when you're on the play, which is where you're going to side it in most of the time. Now here are your power rankings. A final score of 63. That's pretty far up there for a deck that's really cheap. I'll tell you how cheap in a second, but you already know because you saw in the thumbnail, so it doesn't matter. But still, you know, we get to a deceptively high score here, even though we get, like, it looks like a bunch of middle-of-the-road categories. You know, we're really high in consistency. We're one color. We draw a bunch of cards. We play some 4-ofs. We're a really consistent deck. You know, we almost always do what we're trying to do. That's consistent, but we're also reasonably versatile. You know, we can play a control-y game, we can play a more aggro game, we can play a straight-up tempo game if we have to. We have a lot of ways of playing this game, and it may take a skilled pilot like any tempo deck, but you can respond to just about anything your opponent's doing and disrupt it accordingly, if you know how to play this deck. So it's a very versatile thing. Try this thing out. It's only like $30, in this iteration at least, on TCG Player right now. They do sponsor my content, but you knew that already as well if you watched my stuff before. But you also know that I picked them as my sponsor because they are legitimately the cheapest place you can get Magic cards on the internet. They're the only place you're going to get this deck for $30. So click the link in the description. You can view the deck list on their website and grab any pieces you need for it. But with that, I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out, so it's your turn. Go to the comments section. Let me know how you felt about this weird thing or any ways you think that it could be improved beyond what we've already done to the deck here. So let me know. Give me your thoughts. Sound off on me down there in the comments section. And on your way out, do all the other stuff. You know, like the video, share the video. Can't stress how much sharing the video actually helps me. It's a lot. But you can also subscribe, hit the bell to make sure you get the notifications. We've got more decks coming up, list videos, spoilers for Guilds of Ravnica right around the corner. A lot of cool content coming up. Plus, a couple of new things I've been wanting to try out. So make sure you're subbed for all that stuff. Lots of cool content coming. Plus, you could always join the Patreon if you really wanted to, if you like my face that much. All I ask is $1 a month. Help out around here. Keep the lights on. Let me keep doing what I love for a living. And, you know, let me keep throwing information in your face all like 3 times a week at least. You know? Patreon is really the whole reason I can continue doing this and living this ridiculous, amazing existence. So if you want to help out, throw $1 in there, click the link in the description, and I'm pretty sure I've said it all. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTG Dev. That's all the shilling. That is all the shilling I have to do. But in any case, I'm Dev from the place. You know that by now too. And I will catch you cats later. Anyway, thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.